The theme of my talk today, I was actually changing it just a little bit backstage in light of that awesome speech by Kirk Cameron. That was amazing. That was the best walk-up song that y'all just sang for me. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything that has fired a person up more than that, so that was amazing. But the theme of my talk specifically is children and how we can protect children and the convictions that I have developed not just as a Christian who, by the grace of God, has been sanctified in my Christian walk by the Holy Spirit and is still being sanctified, but also as a mom. I became a mom about 4 years and 8 months ago. She likes to tell me exactly how old she is. She'll be 5 in July, and then I've got 2 more younger than her. And so I am a mom of 3, and because of that, my mind has changed and my beliefs have solidified and grown stronger in so many ways as a Christian. I had the grace and the privilege of being raised in a Christian home, and so I can't say that I have drastically different values than I had growing up. My parents are amazing. I was Southern Baptist, and so we went to church on Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night. Basically, every time the doors were open, we were there. And while at the time, I probably felt like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that we're going back to church, I am so thankful. I wouldn't trade that foundation for the world. I can credit that foundation, of course, and the mercy of God for everything that I believe today and the strength of my convictions today. But the Lord has used motherhood to solidify so many of the values, so many of the theological beliefs that were instilled in me growing up, and also has made me realize things that I just didn't know a few years ago. When you become a parent, everyone who is a parent in this room, whether you're an adoptive parent or you're a biological parent, this crazy exchange happens when your child is born or when you meet your child for the first time. For me, when they placed my daughter on my chest, I just felt this indescribable wave wash over me that, oh my gosh, I would do anything for this little person that I just met. Absolutely anything for this little human being. All of the hopes and fears that I had for myself were immediately transferred onto her. Everything that I wanted for myself or feared for myself mattered so much less because now I have this human being that I love so much more than I could ever love myself. I want so much more for her than I could ever want for myself. Parenting teaches you a lot. It teaches you, of course, how the Lord sees us. If I, as a finite, sinful, fallible human being, love my child this much, oh my goodness, the God who is love, 1 John 4:8, loves me so much more than that, and he would do so much more for me. And in fact, he did. He sent his son to die for me. Wow, you realize that in a very tangible way when your child is born, but then you also realize that all of these political and so-called culture war issues that we see on the news, that we see on social media every day, that they're not just these abstract things happening, but they're affecting real people. And of course, this is something that you can realize before you become a parent, but it changes. Because I've always been pro-life, but after my daughters were born, I can't think of abortion without remembering the first time I saw their heartbeats on the sonogram screen. And I've always known the definition of marriage is between a man and a woman, but I can't think of the definition of marriage without considering what it would be like if my children didn't have a father or a mother. And I can't think about the issue of gender ideology, even though I've always known the definition of man and woman, without thinking about the fact that I have 3 daughters who are entering into a world in which they have no sports, no bathrooms, no locker rooms of their own. So these are no longer, for me, just abstract political issues that I've always known or have always been taught. They have a real effect on the lives of the little people that I love most. Children, this is something that you'll hear me say a lot if you ever listen to my show. Children are always the unconsenting subjects of progressive social experiments. Children are always the unconsenting subjects of progressive social experiments. So whether that's abortion, gender ideology, the redefinition of the family, even forms of reproductive technology, even COVID policy, forced masking, school closures, children were placed on the altar of the powerful in service to a progressive agenda. Children, because they are powerless, because they don't have any political capital, because they cannot fight back, are always the unconsenting subjects of progressive social experiments. They are always placed on the altar of the moral and the sexual revolution that our country has undergone. And the church, therefore, must be what we have always been, and Kirk explained this so beautifully, must always be a refuge of clarity and calm for them in an age of confusion and chaos. So for children, the church must be what it's always been, a refuge of clarity and calm in an age of confusion and chaos, a refuge against the storm of sexual depravity and deception by continually speaking the truth in love and doing everything that we can to fight against the powers that aim to steal their innocence and even maim their bodies. You know, many times you hear Christians shouldn't wade into politics because politics is divisive. You might lose friends, you might hurt relationships, you might hurt people's feelings. And so often we're deluded with what I call toxic empathy, which is the idea that to be loving, you must just affirm someone's choices and affirm their feelings. But that is not the biblical definition of love. If God is love, 1 John 4:8, then the most loving thing that we can always do is agree with him. If God is love, 1 John 4:8, that means that in love, he created them male and female in his image. The same God who is love created the heavens and the earth. And this is, I think, when you think about it, perhaps the most controversial verse in the Bible, and that's the very first one, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the reason that is so controversial is because of what it means. If God is the creator of all things, then he is the authority of all things. That means he alone gets to say what is and what isn't, what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's false, when life begins, what's a woman and what it's not. And if God is the authority over all things, then that affects everything. It is impossible to separate our politics from our belief that God is the creator and the authority over all things. We cannot separate what he says about the dignity of human life. We cannot separate what he says in the very first chapter of the first book of the Bible, of the definition of marriage, Genesis 1:27, the definition of male and female, Genesis 1:27. We can't separate the knowledge that he gives us graciously and clearly in that first chapter of the Bible from what we think and do politically. Because for the Christian, these issues are not primarily political. They're not primarily political. They're not primarily culture war issues. They're primarily biblical issues. They're primarily Genesis issues. They're Genesis 1 issues. They're Genesis 1:1 issues. They are God created the heavens and the earth issues. And so, while even some of our professing Christian friends may chide us for wading into the abortion conversation, or refusing to use, for example, preferred pronouns, which is lying and something I'm not willing to do to an image bearer of God. When we're chastised for wading into these conversations and standing up for what's right, when we're told that's not empathetic, that's not loving, we just have to remember that this is what the church has always done. The church has always sacrificed their accolades, their approval of the world for biblical truth. And in doing so, we have been a refuge of calm and clarity for the most vulnerable in society, namely for children. There is an incredible book, I reference it all the time. It was written about 20 years ago now, and it's by O.M. Bakke. And he's a historian that explained a lot of what Kirk just said about the early history of the church. And when the church burst on the scene 2,000 years ago, it drastically changed everything. And this book by O.M. Bakke is called When Children Became People. When children became people, it's kind of funny. What are you talking about? Of course, children have always been people. And of course, we know that children have always been people because we can read the Genesis account and see that all people are made in the image of God. They have that innate worth. And yet, in ancient Greece and Rome, that's not how they saw human beings. They didn't see them as image bearers of God. They didn't see them as creations of God with innate dignity and worth that affords them certain inalienable rights. That's not how they saw people. They measured human beings by their productivity and namely by their logos. Specifically in ancient Greece, that word logos, the ability to reason, rationality. And if you look at the ancient writings of the time, how they measured someone's worth was by a man's ability to reason and argue, his education status, and everyone else was really seen on a lower rung of a ladder. An objectification of the elderly, of the sick, of the poor, of the slave, of the woman, and the child was normal because they didn't possess that logos. They weren't quite as capable of rationality. They didn't have as much to bring to the table. So the Greeks regarded children as mentally weak. Romans regarded them as physically weak. They really saw them kind of on the same level of an animal or a barbarian. And maybe they had just been around toddlers and so they knew something. But they weren't just talking about the ages of 2 to 5. They really saw young children and really all children, especially female children, as objects for pleasure, objects for abuse, because they did not have this idea that human beings have value just because of who they are. And so children were very often neglected and abused and mistreated and sold into slavery. That's not true, at least in the Western world anymore. Of course, we know that atrocities do exist like abortion and all of these things, and actually we're entering into kind of a neo-pagan world in which we are adopting some of these ancient practices. But for the past several hundred years, we've seen a change in the world, a revolutionary mindset of how we view the most vulnerable. All of a sudden, children were regarded not just as people, but people who needed special care, who were afforded special dignity. All of a sudden, the poor and the elderly and the sick and the weak and the woman weren't just pushed off to the side and let out into the streets. They were given special shelter, special resources. Again, that special dignity. Why? Because of Jesus. Because the gospel entered into the ancient world and introduced this radical concept of human equality, because all people are made in the image of God, and we are equally dead in our sin apart from Christ and have the equal opportunity to be made alive in Christ by grace through faith. It was that radical message of human worth, of human value, that changed everything, that moves children from the category of subhuman to people. The church changed everything. The gospel changed everything. Christians going out and fighting quote unquote culture wars. Christians going out and being willing to be quote unquote divisive and called unloving by the world changed civilization forever. Changed how the world saw people, changed how the world regarded the weak and the vulnerable and the marginalized. And I just want to make a note, because I think that there is this delusion, I would say especially among the more progressive wing of the United States, that we can lose Christianity in our culture but retain its benefits. That we can become unchristian in belief but remain Christian in practice. That when Christianity goes, we'll keep the orphanages, we'll keep the homeless shelters, we'll keep the excellent hospitals providing excellent and unbiased care. We'll keep this concept of human rights and human dignity. It's not true. We already see a retreat back to pagan values of child sacrifice and human sacrifice. I don't know if you saw Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, who has for years made lots of money off of telling people that they are stupid for believing in God. He was just in an interview, and he said, I am very worried that Britain is losing its Christianity. He said, I don't want people to believe in God, but I still want to sing hymns at Christmas. And I still want us to have churches. And I think if we've got to pick, Christianity, he said, is better than Islam. And he did not realize that when he did Satan's task of convincing people that belief in God is idiotic and uneducated and unsophisticated and regressive, that he helped usher in the paganism that has brought on the ugliness that we are seeing spread throughout Western civilization today. For someone who prides himself on logic and logos and rationality, he has bought in to the completely incoherent belief that you can lose Christianity and retain its rights and benefits and blessings. You cannot. And so when we talk about advancing Christian values in the public square, we're not talking about building a theocracy in which everyone has to become a Christian. That's not what we're talking about building here on earth. What we are talking about is bringing our worldview into the public sphere like everyone else does, by the way. There are lots of people who would have you believe that the only kind of person that has to check their worldview at the door before they bake a cake, before they make a website, before they speak, before they teach in a classroom, before they vote, is the Christian conservative. The atheist, progressive, gets to bring their worldview to the table, to the public conversation. The progressive Christian, paradox of the millennia, they get to bring their worldview to the table, but only the Christian conservative, when they do it, they're a fascist Christian nationalist who wants to create a theocracy. No. We are bringing our worldview to the table just like everyone else. And our worldview says that children matter. Our worldview says that it's wrong to murder an innocent person, and abortion always murders an innocent person. Our worldview, and it's backed by science, by the way, says that there is male, there is female, and they're not interchangeable or fluid. Our worldview says that children need a mother and a father, and that marriage was designed by God and cannot be defined by a legislature. Our worldview seeks to protect the family at all costs because our worldview cares about children. It was our worldview that made children people. And I told you about the logos, this idea that only the person with rationality brings any value. I could think of a few people in Congress who wouldn't qualify, by the way. But how Christianity changed that and said, no, 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 it's not your logos, it's not your rationality. What defines our value? What defines our worth? Capital L, logos. In John 1, the Word made flesh, the Word who was and is God. That word in John 1 to describe Jesus is the capital L, logos. So the capital L, logos, when he entered the world, when he burst on the scene in ancient Greece and Rome, turned lowercase l, logos, on its head and said, no, I will make foolish the wisdom of the world, and I am here to change the game forever. There are really four things that I have, three or four. I can't decide how many I'm going to get to today. I could probably talk about 6 or 7, but there are a few things to kind of summarize what we're talking about that my convictions have really been solidified in, and I've certainly become more passionate about these things, and we've kind of already covered them, but I just want to make sure that we know that these are biblical issues first, and they're political issues because politics matter, because policy matters, because people matter. Politics affects policy, policy affects people, people matter. But for the Christian, they're primarily biblical. They're issues that just have become very personal to me as I've become a mom. And the last one we haven't talked about yet, and it's a little controversial, just a little controversial, maybe even for this room, but bear with me. Number one, abortion is always wrong. And there once was a time when I used to be that person, maybe like some people still in this room today who believed in exceptions. I thought the sophisticated and compassionate take was to say that, of course, there needs to be some exceptions. There should be an exception for rape. There should be an exception for incest. There should be an exception for XYZ. I called myself pro-life. This was as an adult woman several years ago now, but that's what I believed until someone challenged me in a Facebook comment. Never let anyone tell you that you can't change minds arguing on social media. You can. I wish I could thank this person. This was probably 8 years ago now, who told me, what is the difference between a baby conceived in rape and a baby not conceived in rape? Well, nothing. They're both babies. And why should a baby pay for the sins of their father? I believe that if anyone's going to get the death penalty, it should be the rapist, not the baby. And by the way, the pro-choice position is exactly the opposite. They believe that the rapist should not get the death penalty. And in fact, if you're lucky enough to live in a particular city, you might get off scot-free, but the baby should always get the death penalty. That is a subversion of God's order and an absolute blight on the concept of justice. It should never happen here in the United States, and yet it does. And so it is the Christian responsibility to say, no, murdering an innocent person is always wrong. Abortion always murders an innocent person, and therefore abortion is always wrong. So that's number one. That's one thing that I have a belief that has just been solidified to me. And then number two is, again, we've already mentioned, children deserve a mother and father. Do you know that that is controversial to say today? Even in Christian crowds, that maybe we just shouldn't go there. Well, Obergefell was so long ago, it was 2015. And that redefined everything, so shouldn't we move on to other things? Well, look, when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees tried to trip him up, as they always did, on the issue of divorce in Matthew 19. People say, oh, well, Jesus never talked about things like marriage or gender. He never talked about homosexuality, so we shouldn't talk about them either. When Jesus is asked a question about divorce, what does he do? He goes all the way back to creation, and he said, have you not read that in the beginning God made them male and female? And the two shall come together and become one flesh. That is how Jesus answered the question about divorce. He positively defined marriages between a man and a woman. And here's an alliteration that I've been using for years that I find helpful for myself and I hope is helpful for you, because this issue a lot of Christians think is just secondary or tertiary, or like the definition of marriage, it doesn't matter. It's, something that we just don't need to worry about anymore. But this is what I try to remember, why it's so important, and why you see, by the way, churches, pastors, Christian influencers, authors, when they compromise on the LGBTQ issue, they eventually compromise on everything else. Because they deny Romans 1:26 through 27. They eventually deny John 14:6. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. It always happens. Here's why. The definition of marriage is, number one, rooted in creation. Number two, reiterated throughout Scripture. Number three, repeated by Jesus himself. Number four, representative of Christ in the church. And therefore, number five, reflective of the gospel. The definition of marriage between a man and a woman is rooted in creation, Genesis 1:27. It's reiterated throughout Scripture. You shall honor your father and mother. Those gender designations are not arbitrary or accidental or culturally exclusive. Repeated by Jesus himself, as I just said, Matthew 19:4 through 5. Representative of Christ in the church, Ephesians 5. Paul talks about this mystery of marriage and how it is an earthly reflection of the eternal and spiritual marriage between Christ and his church. Christ, who is called the groom, that's a gender designation. The church, that is called his bride, that is a gender designation. Earthly marriage reflects the marriage between Christ and the church. A union between two men and two women can't do that. And because it is representative of the gospel, or because it is representative of Christ in the church, it is therefore reflective of the gospel. The Bible starts with the marriage, Genesis 1. It ends with the marriage between Christ and his church, and Revelation 22. Wow, that's how much God cares about marriage. It is a spiritual, eternal reality with earthly benefits. It is the greatest child protecting institution that exists. There is, in general and statistically, no safer place for a child than with their mother and father. Are there exceptions to that? Of course, because there's sin and there's all kinds of things that happen in the world, but that is in general true. God made it that way for a purpose. Okay, number 3 and 4. Oh, I don't have very much time. Can we go really quickly? Okay, maybe I don't even need to explain, because both of you probably agree on both of these. Number 3, pornography should be outlawed. There have always been limitations on speech. I'm not really worried about banning pornography being the thing that upends the First Amendment. There have always been limitations to it. There have always been obscenity laws on the books. Pornography is the legal loophole for human and child sex trafficking. Pornography is a legal loophole for sex trafficking, okay? It should be outlawed altogether. That's number 3, because I care about children. And then number 4, children of Christians should, as far as they are able, if they can at all, should leave the public school system. And I know there may be some exceptions to that, but there are far fewer exceptions, I think, than we think. In the words of Vodi Bakum, if you send your children to Caesar, don't be surprised when they come back Romans. All education is indoctrination. All education places doctrines in its students. The question is, what doctrines do you want your children to learn 40 plus hours a week? Do you want them to learn the doctrines of the world, the secular doctrines, which are, in many ways, especially today, anti-biblical? And I know there are many of you who think, not my school. My child's teacher is also her Sunday school teacher, and our church or our school, they're they're not worried about that woke stuff. I promise you the time is coming. I promise you it is. With the changes to Title IX, before you know it, it will be at your school. And even if not, even if your school, your public school is the nicest and sweetest and most Christian public school, I promise you your kids are not learning theology every day. So if you have the choice between an anti-biblical education and your children only learning maybe a couple hours of theology every week versus a Christian education, whether it's homeschool or whether it's a really good Christian private school, if that's something that you can do, where they are receiving 40 plus hours of biblical education every week, which one is better? It's our responsibility as parents to steward our children, to steward their hearts and minds, and we cannot guarantee their salvation. That's not what this is about. I know people who graduated from public school who are strong Christians. I went to a Christian school, kindergarten through 12th grade. I graduated with some people who need to come back to Jesus. And so I'm not saying that this guarantees salvation. We give our children a Christian education because it is obedient to God. And because planting those seeds, I do believe, bears fruit. It does. There are so many people I know who also, they left the faith for a little bit. I had my own time of wandering when I was in college, but it was the hymns that my mom sang me. It was the memories of seeing my mom every morning read the Bible. It was the prayers that she prayed for me in a journal that she gave me. It was the church Sunday school lessons that I heard every week that brought me back, that God used to remind me what is good and right and true. And as a mom, I understand that discipling our kids can be really difficult, especially when they're in those toddler years, and I certainly have not perfected this at all, but you see that fruit sometimes in the most random moments when you're like, I didn't even know you were paying attention when we were talking about that. My oldest, she's getting kind of into that stage where she says things that I'm just like, wow, that was your own thought. That was amazing. She had a stomach bug the other day, and she was asking me, she asked all the questions, why do people get sick sometimes? And I'm not thinking theologically. This is early in the morning, and we were dealing with throw up. And I was like, I don't know, baby. They just do. And she said, is it because Adam and Eve ate all those apples? And I said, yes, that is why. And she said, when Jesus comes back, people won't get sick anymore. And I said, yes, you're right about that. When Jesus comes back, there will be no more abortion. There will be no more murder. There will be no more corruption. There will be no more politics. There will be no more sin, no more sorrow, nothing to worry about, nothing to distract us. Jesus will come back and rule in perfect peace and joy forever and ever. But it hasn't happened yet. So we have some work to do. And I'll just end with this. This is what I like to say, because I don't know your sphere of influence. I don't know what talents God has given you. I don't know your resources and your gifts. Here's all we can ever do, and it is always enough. Do the next right thing in faith with excellence and for the glory of God. Do the next right thing in faith with excellence and for the glory of God until we are on the other side of eternity. Thank you.